Assalamu alaikum. Hello, Adabers. I'm Binish Ahmed, your host for Azadi Now. Welcome to one of our first live episodes. Today, we're in conversation with the author, Dr. Inshah Malik. Dr. Inshah Malik is an assistant professor of political theory and international relations at Khattab University in Kabul, Afghanistan, and a visiting professor at University of Washington. She was awarded a PhD degree from Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. A former Fox Fellow at Yale University, her monograph on Muslim women, agency and resistance politics, A Case of Kashmir, was published in Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. Her research interests include political theory, history of Islam, political movements, questions of sovereignty, and gender studies in Central and South Asia, particularly India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kashmir. She can be reached on Twitter at Inshah Malik. Welcome to Azadi Now, Inshah. Thank you for joining us. Can you get her on?
Yeah, 1 second. Cameras probably please switch to
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Binish, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to go off air quickly. I'm experiencing some technical. So I did switch, but it's not showing. Okay. This technical issues with my camera. What we'll do is we'll get started. So welcome to Azadi Now, Inshah. Thank you for joining us. In this episode, we get to know Professor Malik as a writer and talk to her about her book, Muslim Women, Agency and Resistance Politics, The Case of Kashmir. In our first segment, we get to know the author. My first question to you, Inshah, is when did you first know you wanted to be a writer?
That's a very difficult question for me. I'm actually quite of an accidental writer, if I would say. Um, I I moved to Bombay when I was 19 to get my education from there. I joined SNDT University, where it was the first time for me to actually interact, as I had grown up in Kashmir and I'd seen a very different atmosphere of militarization and a lot of political violence that marked my teenagehood. So when I moved to Bombay, I was particularly inspired by the cultures of academics there, and how through ideas and through freedom of speech, one could actually express, their belonging and their ideas of who they are. And for me, certain experiences of discrimination that I faced as a Kashmiri Muslim coming from a Muslim society, I felt there was a lack or a sort of distance, which wasn't just a physical distance, but an intellectual distance between how Kashmiris were perceived in India. And that led to, sort of looking at my own self and looking at what I had gone through and looking at ideas and politics that was more liberationist and that within which I could find a voice for myself as a Kashmiri woman. And that led to the idea that I had, there was a lot to say, and there were like fewer mediums. And I think I was one of the people at the time who decided to actually use writing as a medium to discuss what was going on in Kashmir. And not just only to inform others, but also to inform myself. Like, how do I look at what I have gone through, and how do I conceptualize my own experiences of violence and conflict that I had seen in Kashmir. So, yeah, precisely it was then. And then a particular moment, I think, in 2010, when Kashmir saw its first nonviolent uprising against the Indian rule. Um, so we had somewhere around 187 boys who were killed by Indian Army, were shot dead point blank. And I was a witness to that because I was visiting home that time, and I was a witness to a lot of that violence and how it permeated, and how these cycles of violence were basically on and on and on. And I think as we speak, they are still on and on right now. And that particular moment sparked much more of my interest in conceptualizing and understanding why certain set of people are experiencing the kind of occupation and oppression the way they are. So yeah, I would say that was a very important moment in my own personal journey.
Wow, that sounds like quite the journey. Is it easy for you to find time to write now? What is your writing schedule like?
Oh, I'm usually not a very methodical writer. I write because I feel something is left unsaid and it needs to be said, or I feel that discourses are, monopolizing a particular narrative, or a particular narrative is being pushed through, the discourses that allow us to think in a modern society. I think those are some of the possibilities that encourage me to write. So what I do is I usually conceptualize before I go ahead and write a whole piece. I think abstractly, which is perhaps difficult, because a lot of writers are more. I mean, if we take writer as a writer, as in not an academic, writers are usually more observant, and they are detail oriented, and they write about what they see, and they write about what are the practical implications of what they see on the lives of people, which is like very interesting. But for me, I think I think abstractly, I think conceptually, and I first conceptualize what I want to say, and then I expand on that with details that I can find, or details that seem to speak back to the kind of abstract idea that I have at that point. And yes, I do have a lot of time that goes by where I don't write anything, and I haven't figured out why that is. I guess I have to really be very convinced that I have something very important to say, and that's only when I write. I don't usually write all the time. Yeah. Are you there, Binish? I guess there are some technical issues again.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I was speaking, and obviously the tech stuff is not working, not being our friend. But my next question for you is, your work is inspirational to many Kashmiri writers, including myself. Could you share 3 Kashmiri and 3 non-Kashmiri writers that have inspired you?
Oh, it's a very difficult question for me to answer. I would start with the non-Kashmiri writers first, because I think at this stage, it's also important to reflect on our own reality, and which has been that English is relatively a less explored medium of expression for Kashmiris. I think we have done enormously well in other languages. If you see Kashmiri, if you see Persian, if you see Urdu, we have some remarkable intellectuals and poets whose works are there. And unfortunately, because of the repeated, colonization and occupations, we are not familiar with those works. And even if we are familiar, it's very limited. So I think for me, to begin with, in looking back at Kashmir's history, I think two authors or two writers come prop up quite prominently. One is Azad, who is like the one of the first prominent uh, left-leaning or socialist writers of Kashmir. And then you have, of course, Ghani Kashmiri, which is older than that, much older, during the Mughal period, who is not a court poet, who is more of a, he's more of a rebel poet, and his poetry has spoken to me quite a bit of whatever I have been able to read. So these two have, distinctly impacted my own way of thinking. And I think I should not forget Premnath Bazaz's work in Kashmir, which is a, I think, historical genius in some sense, with the kind of meticulousness it has used in capturing Kashmir's early history, especially early modern history. So these three writers, they do directly speak to me when it comes to Kashmir. And of course, we have so many contemporary English writers who I am impressed by, particularly, for instance, our own Athar Zia. I really like her very effective form of writing. Um, but apart from that, I think because my inclination has been philosophy in general, so I know that there's a lot of, slack that academics get for bad writing. So, but still, at the cost of being labeled a bad writer or not knowing writing well, I think I would still go with writings of Hannah Arendt or Judith Butler, for instance, and writings of some philosophers of that repute. Um, yeah, that's mostly it. But I'm not. I'm not also a person who gets fixated on particular writings or particular narratives, and and define myself or my own style based on that. But yes, I can consider these as influences that have helped me in my intellectual journey to a great extent. I don't have your voice. Sorry, Bidish. I really don't mean to do that, but
Okay. I apologize. It was the button. I didn't press a button this time. So I was saying that her, the names that you're mentioning actually really resonate with me as well. What's your advice? What advice would you give to upcoming writers, particularly Kashmiri writers that are younger?
Uh, I think Kashmiris, by default, we are a complex community. We are a community that was shaped by a lot of intellectual influence. And unfortunately, we have lost access to what defines us really, given the kind of political, political oppression that we deal with. It's very difficult to really speak to people about our intellectual traditions. I think it's important for Kashmiris to look back at their own intellectual traditions in the interest to understand themselves better, in the interest to educate people, and also in the interest to find a voice which is distinct, which is not trampled by the global political dispensation, or which is not trampled by what is, an accepted norm of what is allowed and not allowed. I think Kashmiris, by tendency, seem to have a very philosophically complex voice of their own, I think they need to look back at that. They need to redefine it. They need to question it, criticize it, and create a kind of create a kind of identity for our new generation that can answer their questions about what we're facing today. I don't think it should be, a lot of abstract discussions that don't speak to them at a personal level. I think what we need to learn is that we can change the narrative if we want. We can change the ways we have thought so far and what hasn't worked, and that can only happen when we have a clearer understanding of the complexity of our own thinking. So my in short, my very simple advice is to really go back and look at who we really are and what we've done so far, intellectually. And it doesn't matter if it's in English language or in Persian or in Kashmiri or whatever languages, because these are all important to understand our sensibilities today.
Thank you for that very insightful response. My next question for you is, have there been surprises along the way in your writing life? Are there some pleasant and unpleasant ones that you'd be interested in sharing with us today?
It's like, for me, especially because I come from a middle class family. My parents are educated, but we didn't have anyone in our family who had taken up writing quite seriously. And in place like Kashmir, which are very class-based societies, and certain professions have remained for a particular set of people. So it's unquestioned for people from certain backgrounds to access certain kind of social, political, and economic wealth. So for me to go into the journey of becoming a writer, it wasn't easy. And not only because it was made difficult, but also because I wouldn't have chosen anything that was simple. I think it's also my character to not go after something which is readily available. My biggest help and positive approach that I received was from my own father, who from very childhood really encouraged me, because he was himself quite interested to be to be in an intellectual field, but because of the limitations of family and taking care of other liabilities and responsibilities, he wasn't able to go through that track. So I think to a great extent he had a role in shaping my intellectual curiosity and never really pushing it, and asking me to basically stop asking questions. He was encouraging from very early life, as I remember, and he never actually stopped me from going ahead and pursuing what I wanted to. I think for me the biggest hurdles were accessibility. Um, um, as a Kashmiri, when you go in that time, especially, I don't know, now it has changed. A lot of Kashmiris are leaving India and going abroad for studies. But when I was, I was in late teenage, and I was trying to figure out what to study and how to go through it. I had to go through a process, and that process was like going to India and studying there, and you unravel oppressive, oppressive systems or systematic oppression at several levels. So I remember when I went to the university in Bombay, like it was very common to think of Kashmiris as terrorists. I think that hasn't changed much even today, but it was something so normal that it was you were constantly being told to your face that you guys are terrorists, you come from Kashmir. So and within that atmosphere, you have to push and seek your rights and your access to knowledge and information. It was quite tough, to be honest. And I think many of us do feel discouraged to even pursue that journey anymore, because we are being challenged and opposed and imprisoned even for expressing views that India or Indian system doesn't allow. So for me, it was it was a lot of, I mean, a lot of what I did was really just speaking back to those experiences, systematic oppression that I have faced as a Kashmiri, as a woman, at different levels within India and Kashmir. So I think like it's not an easy journey, especially if uh, you are attempting to think differently in a system that is designed to oppress you. It's very difficult. So, but yeah, if when I look back, I wouldn't change anything because I feel that's what has made me and helped me to find my voice that I have today. And I hope that that's helpful for at least my own self, if not anyone else.
Thank you for that response. My next question for you is, why did you choose political theory and gender as directions for your research and scholarship, as opposed to, taking many other routes?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And like I was saying, I had come from Kashmir. I'd grown up through the conflict and violence from 1989, and I had very little time to even explore what does it mean to be Kashmiri or mean to be a woman. And then when I came to India, I was bombarded with all of these kinds of questions like why are Kashmiris terrorists or why is Islam so violent against women? Mm, which was quite contrary to the experiences that I've had in Kashmir. I didn't have those experiences of what the media narrative was said to say. And it's not to say that okay, there is no patriarchal oppression in Islam, or there's no oppression in any community, or there's some perfect, ideal, utopic Islamic world that is perfect, or Muslim world, or Muslim community that is perfect. I felt a lot of ideas about Kashmir were rooted in a sort of misinformation. Sometimes it was not deliberate, but oftentimes it was a deliberate misinformation that is projected to displace what is indigenous, what is normative, what is known. And what I knew about Kashmir through experience, or like what I had learned from my grandparents or what I had learned from my parents, didn't resonate in that narrative that I could read. So when I looked at, so my interest was looking at Kashmiri women and how they struggle within the political situation that existed at that point in Kashmir. And I was exploring a lot of feminist theory, especially the work of Indian, what I called as the interventionist feminism, where a lot of Indian women supported by the government through NGOs or other kinds of works would actually come to Kashmir to write about what women were going through. And somehow the limitation was created by the fact that the feminist theory was somehow it had excelled to a great extent to include voices of people from other races or people who have suffered class oppression or had basically considered the idea of intersectionality to a great extent. But when it came to religion, and particularly Islam, there was a sort of hesitancy in the way feminist scholars would think about what to consider as feminism, right? And given that feminism hadn't started really as a political thought process, it started more like a political movement, and therefore many times had to struggle with finding the right kind of conceptions that can help us understand women's subjection in different parts of the world. So what I found in the literature was that there was something to go by, but a lot of it was quite limited by a very myopic and Orientalist view of Islam and Muslim societies. They were either seen as cultural symbols, like whose job it is to just wear a headscarf or wear a hijab and obey their husband and don't have any agency or don't really do anything, which was like, you cannot in any way describe Kashmiri women as that. Like it's just, it's just historically wrong because Kashmiri women have been very strong matriarchs throughout the history, right? So I felt that there was a lot was missing, and it wasn't only because of the propagandist politics that's going on, which is Islamophobia and other kinds of politics that are clubbed together to suppress Kashmiris. But it was also because we hadn't really contributed to the political theory or the streams of political theory within the larger feminism or feminist theory to understand the subjection that Muslim women or Kashmiri Muslim women particularly have faced or have understood. And also partly because the question of agency within feminism is a problematic conception. Like earlier feminists would think that agency is, our ability to act can only be considered an ability of a feminist nature if a woman is opposing her husband or is opposing her family or is opposing her religion. But we hadn't really come to the grasp or come to terms with the political theory that seems to question the very idea of agency as individualistic or as somehow men or either men or women are somehow free to take individual action, because most of the gendered action is a sort of creation of our social norms. Not only that, and if we look at what Butler's work says, it's like it's not only your social upbringing, but it's actually a performance that you do deliberately to get by and to live or make meaning of your social world. So I think those ideas or those underpinnings of the theory are very essential to problematize how we have looked at Muslim women, and then of course to remove it completely from the from the way it has actually gotten strewn with the idea of colonialism.
Thank you for sharing those insights. And I hope that this is helpful for younger people who are thinking about what is it that, resonates for them and speaks to them specifically and what choices they make. My next question for you helps us transition into the feature for today, the book. And so this is the last question in our segment of getting to know you as a writer, as an author. The question is, how long did it take you to write your book, and what did the writing process teach you about yourself?
It's a very important question for me, because when I look back at that process, because it was so enmeshed with my own personal experiences, as well as I was saying, because I grew up in Kashmir and I went to India and I had to experience systemic difficulties and oppression at so many levels. So the book for me was like it was actually a sort of exposition of certain traumas that are collective. If when we talk about feminist theory or we talk about women, I think body is that essential element. Body is that essential, bodily vulnerability is that essential element that connects us. So for me, I had a lot of data, and I've written my PhD thesis, and I take this thesis in my hand and I'm like, what does it really mean? Like, how can I make it beyond or more than what is an academic requirement, right? Writing a thesis is an academic requirement. So for me, it took about a year, and it took a lot of, just sitting there, rethinking and thinking and rethinking about the text. What I do understand about this book is that it's actually like there's like much more theoretically that needs to be understood and exposed and clarified, which I haven't done, because for me, I was quite pressed by the urgency of the work. I felt that we were in a dire need as a community of women who needed a consolidated voice, like where we could actually locate ourselves historically, because a lot of this material is inaccessible. And we also have to remember that we as Kashmiris do not grow up learning our own history or our own culture, or, we're not taught any of that. So to actually research and write about things that have been made taboo in certain sense it was quite a lot of burden on me, in a sense that I wanted to make sure that all of it is presented at least once in a cohesive format. So I feel that this book, because I wrote it like quite quickly in a year's time, and that's partly because it was just in my head. It was more like a place, where people can come and read and get a quick sense of what Kashmiri women have done so far, or who they are, or how do they visualize themselves. And of course, this is not to say that I represent, or the book represents, all Kashmiri women. It doesn't. It represents women who have actively participated in political struggles against the Indian state. So these are particular women who kind of uh, set the tone for what the resistance politics is all about, and also why and how women find their voice within those larger political struggles and narratives. So yeah, for me, the process was not easy. It was tough, but I was just, I think, inspired by the fact that it was quite urgent to write it, and I was pushed by that urgency so I could kind of finish it. So I definitely feel that this book is just the beginning of countless and endless number of Kashmiri intellectuals, women and men, who would come from it, or through it, or with it, um, or critique it, or whatever. I just felt that it was that possibility that I had to put out there. Yeah.
Thank you for those insights and thoughts again. Now we transition into our second segment for the show today with Professor Malik, where she presents her book. Following this, I've got quite a few questions prepared for you, but I will prioritize the live Q&A audience that's watching. So for those folks, keep your questions ready. Think about them. You can share them on the live stream's Facebook or YouTube comment section, and we'll get them and we'll present them to Dr. Malik. And without further ado, you can take it away, Dr. Malik. Please present your book to us.
Thank you so much, Binish. I think through our questions and answers, we have fairly covered at least the political ideas as well as the theoretical conundrums that I was dealing with through this book. But to clarify a little bit more, I think the book has two important aspects. It's one aspect of it is to look at the concept of agency and the concept of identity politics, which in this case is like Muslim women, and how they have been looked at and why they have been clubbed into a certain narrative of victimization. So the book actively deals with this question of why Muslim women in general are seen as perennial victims of patriarchy. And somehow their victimization is much more prominent or shown only when it's about their oppression through the religion that they practice, or the contexts within which religious law is encouraged or reinforced. And somehow how that understanding and how that very colonial modality of understanding Muslim women has been projected onto Kashmiri women's subjection, where it doesn't necessarily hold true, partly because this is what the book tries to argue, that Muslim women are not just the products of their religion, but they're also product of the history, the society, the culture, the economic status, or class status, or caste status in case of India. Um, all of these things are attributing factors that define or that create their subjection or subjectivity. I think one of the prominent scholars that raises a similar concern is Saba Mahmood when she says that religion is far less investigated, or our women's connection to religion is far less investigated in the feminist theory. And her book was one of the important, thinking tools for me within this book as well. So what then the book tried to do was then look at what was the need to look at women as cultural symbols and not products of their history or culture or civilization, and just look at them as women oppressed by religion or oppressed by their religious practice. And similarly, like as I said earlier, also what I was constantly, and I think a lot of Kashmiris would recognize this and resonate with it, that a lot of narrative, the public narrative, was that it's the same for Kashmiri women. They're oppressed and they're, they adhere with Islam, and therefore they don't have rights and they don't have any sort of possibility to express themselves or be in a state of uh, what they would how they would be considered as individual or free or independent. So for Kashmiri women as well, similar kind of approach was kind of existed within the feminist theory as well, or within the feminist works, as I said previously, to finish. So what the book does is it problematizes the idea of agency. That look, agency is not necessarily, especially in the societies that are pre-industrial societies, that are not shaped by industrialization, that are shaped by a certain kind of history in the East that is still far less explored. And in the post-colonial setting, where we have countries like India and Pakistan that try to dominate a narrative onto these societies, where we don't have, which are not characterized by a certain industrialization, and characterize these societies as primitive or outdated or not modern, which is untrue because. Now, when we look at Kashmir, which is a sort of, it's a society which is shaped by a lot of historical turmoil, except of course industrialization at the point, at certain point in history, but it has its influences. Like when we look at Kashmir's first instances of modern freedom struggle, we see there are influences from very modern political ideologies like Marxism or communism. And we see those ideas getting intermixed or being used simultaneously with a certain sort of Islamic liberationist theology. So now the question of women's agency was then to look at their capacity for individualized action, and therefore that individualized action isn't possible in societies that are created through a kind of communitarian ideology, or let's say a sort of agrarian politics, or an agrarian communitarianism, if there is a possibility to define it. Because if you look at societies in Afghanistan, in Kashmir, in Iran, these are largely not Iran so much, because Iran is now, of course, it's an industrialized society, but in societies like these, which are predominantly agrarian, so you see a certain kind of modality of urban rural, and a very robust sort of class structure, which doesn't allow people for individual action. And not only that, but even when we look at the models of sovereignty that existed in this region from prehistorical time, these models of sovereignty only allowed for certain classes to be political. People were never politicized. So the idea of democracy or democratic will or democratic education of ordinary people doesn't help political legitimization. So what I mean by that is, so Kashmiri society, which is defined or created through a class system of the rulers, and then you have you have the priest class, and then you have the general population, which is mix of agrarian craftsmen as well as farmers or agriculturalists. So in that section, what you see happening is that in that complexity of it, large number of people are outside of the politics, outside of having a political say of what should happen. And somehow, what was much more accentuated in the politics between India and Kashmir is to look at Kashmiris as therefore a mob. Like it's a mob politics where people come together and they just reject something, or they agree with something, or they don't like something, or they come and protest. And I think the idea is still it's still prevalent after the annexation in 2019. But that's unfortunately a very colonial way of looking at Kashmir politics, and the book does exactly that. In order to construct women as agents, or as people who have had a say, who have had a historical, a contribution, or who have done things within Kashmir's history, it was important to then look at Kashmir's resistance politics. That why we have just within Kashmir's general political realm, we have this idea of julus or protest, but we don't have a clear cut in investigation of what prompted those and how did people manage to come together. I think that the proactivity of Kashmiri population and the politics of people coming together and working together for political will or for political objectives and motives. I think this book constructs that and shows how Kashmiri politics, which is a politics of right to self-determination, is always found its voice within the people when the institutions and class politics has failed them. So when if you look at, so I construct the early Kashmiri nationalism in the book, and I look at how Sheikh Abdullah kind of seemed to appear as a legitimate voice of Kashmiris who wanted their right to self-determination, but somehow when he failed on that promise, that how again people turned against him, as an indication to show that that the idea of self-determination, or idea of freedom, or idea of agential politics that is good for the larger betterment of the society has always rested with a people's politics, of which women have been very, very remarkable part, and they have taken a very proactive role. So throughout different chapters, I then seek to investigate different movements that have happened after 1947, because apparently within the larger international narrative, there tends to be a sort of consensus that okay, Kashmiris have acceded to India, and therefore there is no more discussion about what happened there. And the whole historical narrative of how Kashmiris look at themselves and how do they interact with their political environment, it's outside of the theory. So my book tried to bring all of this to the center of the conversation. Like it tried to shift the conversation from whether Kashmiris have acceded or not to a conversation about what Kashmiris are asking and how that has manifested in different forms of the political movements that have existed after 1947. And then why women have found a potential for themselves to represent themselves within people's politics. I mean, apart from, of course, we have a lot of pro India state politics in which women have participated, but why a lot of women have consistently seen themselves as part of the people's politics, it again has to do with how women have seen themselves, not necessarily only as women, but seen themselves as leaders, community leaders. So what I do in a chapter, in the second chapter, I look at actually look at the mobilizations and how women have taken proactive roles not only the roles that Indian feminists have argued, the roles of, being supporters or aiding armed struggle, or just being an alibi to the normal patriarchy. I think that that stands challenged in the book, because I talk about how they have taken proactive leadership roles in times when such roles have been denied for upper class women, and somehow you see that the liberationary potential for women has always been with the street politics than with the state politics, where they're seen that, or women don't necessarily have equal rights with men, or however else they wanted to visualize themselves in different movements. And then moving on, I look at 1989 armed struggle and what led to Muslim identity becoming a central focus for Kashmir's resistance politics. And I look at how Indian state's response to Kashmiris was largely defined by religious bigotry towards Muslims in general, and of course, it was informed by the partition politics, where the politics of India and Pakistan somehow is also projected onto Kashmiris because they're seen as primarily as Muslims. They're not seen as Kashmiris, or they're not seen as separate from Pakistan. And therefore, the projection of such an anti-Muslim bigotry and hate, uh, it leads to a sort of very robust and very horrifying counterinsurgency measures. And women in Kashmir, despite such stringent political atmosphere, violent political atmosphere of violence, of death, of rape, women choose to get out and fight in using notions that have seemed like they are patriarchal notions, but throughout the book, I show how these patriarchal notions are turned on their head to help women to proclaim more liberationary or sort of revolutionary conceptions from the history of Islam, and use them to fight against the oppression that they see inflicted by the Indian state. So in this chapter, I think it was one of the most interesting chapter for me to write, because it was abstractly very rich. It was looking at a lot of influences on Kashmir's politics, right from Afghanistan to Palestine, and like how these movements in the West Asia have influenced Kashmir's political identity and has influenced their own idea about themselves. I mean, beyond what the general limitation we have faced in defining Kashmiris outside of India and Pakistan's relationship. This chapter does fairly well on that account and tries to um, bring out these nuances of why and what attracts people um, towards West Asian sort of trends of politics. And I still remember I was a kid that time. I don't know if this anecdote has found its place in the book, but I remember that even the fall of Soviet Russia in Afghanistan had a huge impact on the general psychology of Kashmiri community at that point. Finally, I also look at the aftermath of 2010 and how a largely peaceful movement that sought self-determination for Kashmiris was crushed through rampant violence and basic, like, clear oppression, and how within that a younger generation of women writers who had now started writing in English and were kind of talking back to the empire um, had appeared, and I investigate their agency of why they chose to write proactively against what they saw happening in their atmosphere. I think the book is it speaks I have, I mean, completely in my mind that I see myself as writing for Kashmiris. I see myself predominantly writing myself for younger Kashmiri intellectuals, but of course for the world to understand what's going on in Kashmir. So I think this book should help a large number of students to get started, and get interested in the conceptions and ideas that I've explored here. And I think it should also respond to a lot of academic inquiry and curiosity about Kashmiri Muslims or Kashmiris or Kashmir culture or Kashmir in general. Um, I I also think that after the annexation of Kashmir in in 2019, a lot of the discussions and debates here kind in the book kind of need to be revisited, and they need to be looked at from the angle of a new cultural imperialism that we are going to be, or we are facing, or we are being subjected to. So I think my hope is that the book is read and engaged with, and of course it can help for our own in cultural intellectual cultures to sort of develop. I'll stop here. I hope I haven't gone overboard, but if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Wow, thank you so much for that overview of the book and what led you to kind of engage with the subject in the way that you have. I found that very, very helpful. Now, this is our Q&A section. We asked the viewers to take a moment and think about what you would want Dr. Malik to speak to in the next 10 or 15 minutes that we've left in the live stream. And in the meanwhile, as our questions do come in, I will ask some of the questions as I've come up with some myself as well. So my first question to you, Dr. Malik, is what research methodology did you apply in answering your research question, and why? How did you end up choosing what you chose?
Yeah, it's a very important question for me. At that point, because I myself, I felt myself that my voice was sort of missing from the conversation. So I felt that the only methodology that could respond to that lack was ethnography. So at that point, I decided to go through the qualitative research methodology, and I went to Kashmir and I interviewed around 50 women from different movements and different stages of Kashmir's history to bring out those perceptions and opinions that were non-existent within the theory. And of course, I also looked at a lot of literature review and primary accounts that had been written long time ago, especially in newspaper articles and articles that have existed as oral narrative. I think such a method has helped me to access a lot of understanding or knowledge of Kashmir, which is otherwise very difficult to access. In societies like Kashmir, where we still have much more old world culture of remembrance and repetition, so it's very important to access these narratives through ethnographic data collection or through interview methods or through in-depth collection of in-depth knowledge and narrative. I think it's important because people have subjective knowledge of what they have been through, but also there are people who have who are intellectuals because they have been dedicated to studying and understanding their own political condition for the longest time. And I think that for me, in my own personal, writing and book, I think I've learned so much from my from the people that I've interviewed. I've understood much more, and I would not lie if I say that that was my real political education than what I learned in my universities. As a person coming from a very different background, so this methodology, of course, we do understand, historically what such methodologies have meant. and how they have contributed to, I don't know, colonization and whatnot. For me, I think it's possible for indigenous scholars to reverse it, to use it for the betterment of communities, to educate ourselves on how we view ourselves and what knowledge sources we have available. And of course, contribute to the overall general knowledge in a world of ideas through how we have been thinking, or exposing basically the indigenous ways of doing politics or history or stuff. Yeah.
Um, Thank you. The next question is, what surprised you the most in your research findings?
Mm, I was enormously surprised on many occasions, and I don't know if it's possible to bring it together in a very short answer. But what I was I was so basically I was struggling to understand what was going on myself as well, because I went to so I grew up in Kashmir, and I wasn't so much interested in what was going on, and I went all the way to Bombay, and and I got education there, where I heard a very different narrative that didn't speak to me, and I didn't understand my own subjectivity as well. And then I began to study and get education, and again, it didn't. I felt there was a lack of what needed to be understood. So I had a fresh gaze with which I went back to Kashmir to look at Kashmir, and I was surprised, plentifully surprised by how how just how brilliant and intellectual Kashmiri women are. So, to just give you an example, I interviewed a woman from Batmalu who was now in her 80s. And she was an unlettered woman. She'd never been to school, but she was part of a lot of different movements. Like she was part of um, she was part of the plebiscite front movement. She was part of Sheikh Abdullah's national conference up till he signed the supposed annexation. She had contributed monetarily. She had contributed personally because she said, I haven't married, and it's because I'm so committed to the idea of freedom. I didn't have time to get married. um, and then she had also contributed to her own family, like raising children, raising uh, family members, helping them, educating them. Herself, she wasn't educated. And then, I just sat there and I asked her questions about why she had participated in plebiscite front movement. And I was expecting that, oh my God, how would she even know or understand what was going on then? And she was like, no, I understand what was going on. We wanted to be independent. We didn't want to be with India or Pakistan. And both of these countries wouldn't let us. And then Sheikh Abdullah was espousing this idea for a bit, and I supported him with all my might. But the moment he turned, I spit on his face. Those were the kind of words she used, and it was like political education for me as a youngster at that point, as a young adult. I was just mesmerized by the fact that how brave this lady was to actually have the ideas that she has. And then I met so many other women who were just so powerful enough um, to have a proper, very nuanced understanding of their own trauma and the kind of oppression they faced. So before I did research for this book, I have also traveled extensively in north of Kashmir. So I went to Kunan and Pushpur, and I was among the first people to interview women there. And I remember one of this woman who was repeating the ordeal of how these Indian Army soldiers had raped her repeatedly and twice, actually, in the same night. And when she was talking about it, the narrative that came through was so powerful. It was so different from what you would hear from the activists, like male activists, right? She said, "Well, look, um, you have men who are fighting for freedom. They get raped, they get killed. So it's not because they are weak, it's because they are demanding something they shouldn't. So if we are getting raped, we're getting raped for the same reason. It's not because we're women and it's shame and it's our honor has been removed. And I think the politicization of their participation and how they saw themselves and how they interpreted their ideas of agency, they were quite surprising for me. And they were actually, they gave me the power to look at myself in a very different light and to consistently find myself accountable in my own work, that whether I have done justice in putting those centralizing those voices, and not go on a tangent and say something that is in my head, or that is my own emotion, or that is my own economic gain. So I think I was inspired by the selflessness of the party, of the research participants, and the movements that they had participated in. And those are certain values and ethics I think I also took from them, and I shaped myself as one of those intellectuals that can support the voices of ordinary Kashmiri people.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question from our live audience. I have a couple of others that I was gonna put in, but I do want to prioritize the viewers as well. The one question I have is, my question for Dr. Sahiba: why Kashmiri intellectuals are failed to raise Kashmir case at international forums after abrogation of 370?
It's a loaded question. But thank you for that question. I believe Imran Saib is from Pakistan, and thank you so much for that question. I think it's an important one. Kashmiri people in general face several sanctions, and these sanctions are unfortunate. They are because of the way politics happens or is being administered at this point. Number one, that in Kashmir, people, we have almost half of the population that cannot leave Kashmir on the pretext that some of their relative has been active in any of the resistance politics. So they don't get a passport to travel. And those of who which can travel are basically supported by certain groups or other interested allies who who have their own way of doing politics, which doesn't help Kashmir to a great extent. And it ends up becoming more of a political card that many countries use for their own benefit, but doesn't really help Kashmiris. So I think the failure of Kashmiri intellectuals comes directly from failure of the allies who have kept the pot boiling in Kashmir, but haven't really supported the intellectuals, especially the independent Kashmiri intellectuals, in raising the voices of Kashmir at the international forums. Uh, this is one explanation, but there are many. There are because the entire process is very complex. And for Kashmiri intellectuals to even exist, it's a struggle against so many systematic oppressions that I was talking about. And once they do exist, they have to struggle consistently with finding allyship, which is genuine allyship, and not a way of like confiscating their voices in support of some other geopolitics, in support of something else. I think even if we look at the independence of Kashmiris and the struggles that they have faced and what they have sought for, again, the voices of Kashmiri intellectuals are the most marginalized. So my question from you, Imran Saib, would be why, for instance, in countries like Pakistan or countries that support Kashmir or Kashmiri people's struggle, haven't basically taken full interest in understanding Kashmir or Kashmiri scholarship to begin with, and why the narrative is consistently being played out as if Kashmiris don't exist, and therefore some other country has to come and defend their voices. So I think there is a lot of colonialism in the fact how Kashmiri intellectuals are treated, because they're seen as not capable of having their own voice. And even if they speak out, they're seen as, oh, they are part of some agenda, or they are supporting someone's politics, or they are being projected by India, or they're being projected by Pakistan, or they're being. So there's a lot of suspicion, and unfortunately, this suspicion is part of colonization that India and Pakistan, unfortunately, have attempted to keep it. You know, you've kept it. You've constantly looked at Kashmiris as poor people, victims who need help, but not necessarily as intellectuals who we can talk to and who we can understand things from, and who should be given space to discuss Kashmir. So the only positive thing that I could share with you, Imran Saib, is that Kashmiri intellectuals, despite certain sanctions and issues and struggling with so many levels of oppression, I think they are trying their level best. They write books. Hopefully, people will get to them, people will read them, and people will find a way to resolve this issue permanently. I don't have your voice. Sorry.
This is such a. I forget to press the remove mute button, so thank you for your help with that, Insha. The next question is, we have a couple of questions. So the next question is from Rumsha, who is asking, does Dr. Malik have any message for young women about resistance and using their voice?
I think before as well, we discussed it in detail. For me, I think it's important for all of us, and especially for young women, to understand that any intellectual journey, any journey for freedom is predominantly also a personal journey. So how much ever you pay attention or spend time to educate yourselves, whether it's about politics, whether it's about culture, whether it's about language, anything will contribute to the emancipation of our own selves as well. So I think if we are looking at social patriarchy, or we're looking at social issues that women face, because as we speak, yesterday in Kashmir, there was a very brutal case of a woman burning herself uh, as a protest to domestic violence or whatever. So what we need to do is we need to look at all of these things. We can't say that my interest is that my family should treat me well and rest I don't care. I think women's emancipation is deeply linked with women's politicization, and women's contribution to the political emancipation of Kashmiri society in general. So my recommendation and suggestion, and I don't know what else I can say, is please find your own voice. Please please become more aware. Please take interest in what's going on. And this is not, intellectualism is not about, okay, I want to be like someone. It's about be your best self. And I think we all, as Kashmiri women, as women in general, or as human beings, are capable of becoming the best versions of ourselves. And let's do that, and let's encourage each other to be that as well, especially in such trying times that we are facing in Kashmir right now, and in the world, because of COVID-19. So I think we need to encourage that sense of individualism as well as community responsibility in ourselves as young women. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Sadaf Masoodi, who is asking, what were the other notions, bracket historical or political bracket close, about Kashmiri women you found to be problematic and less questioned or challenged during your research, apart from the idea that Kashmiri women were agency-less victims in the conflict?
That's an important question, and seems like someone who is interested to move beyond this discussion is asking. And I like that question very much, Sadaf. I think there is largely sort of silence about Kashmiri women in general. And then we have certain narratives or writings from cultural perspective, which are not political as such, but cultural perspectives of um, women who have perhaps contributed in terms of now. I mean, again, I need to make this very clear distinction that what my book was responding to was the narrative and the theory that was existing within the feminist narratives in India and in general in the world, that I believe. But if we look at how Kashmiri women are depicted in Kashmir's history, we have a very alternative view. If you look at Premnath Bazaz's Daughters of Vitasta, which looks at a very Kashmiri nationalist way of looking at women. There's no, it's not necessarily a Hindu history or a Muslim history. It's more of looking at how women of this region have been matriarchs and they have participated in political struggles. Um, Overall, there is a lot of material which we could engage in to look at what women have existed as. But yeah, so I think that exploration doesn't have to respond to, let's say, what the world is saying, but it could be placed within the international feminist theory to understand first what Kashmiri women are all about, or what we have done, or what Kashmiri community is all about. And then Kashmiri Muslim women, for instance, what they are all about. And then we can start a much more nuanced theoretical understanding of Kashmir. The other biggest problem that I've found, it may not be necessarily related to women, but it's related to Kashmir in general, that because a lot of scholarship is on Kashmir is either, in English language, I mean, is either from a Western scholarly point of view, or after 1947, it has been a post colonial scholarship which has used a lot of Western tropes and narratives and Orientalism to look at Kashmir from a very Orientalistic point of view. Then again, what you see is a kind of very half-hearted knowledge, a very limited understanding of Kashmir. And again, this there's this strangeness to Kashmir's Muslim identity, which comes through if you look at the Indology. It's an area or a field of studies which has emphasized on Sanskrit, for instance, or looked at Sanskrit language or its contribution to Kashmir. While all of our medieval history is in Persian language after 1180, right? So there is very little in English language that speaks to our Persianate identity, or let's say our Persianate history. And even if there is work on our Persianate history, it's done from a more Hindu nationalist perspective. So if we have scholars who have looked at our Persianate history from a very Indian nationalist perspective, it isn't a perspective where we look at our history. So I think it's very essential for our intellectuals to learn Farsi, to learn Kashmiri, to look at those narratives, to look at the writings of our older writers, and then look at how women feature in that and how we can then use that data to respond to or talk to the political theoretical traditions in the Western Academy.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights on that. There's one question that seems quite general, but I'll share it. I also want to kind of raise the question of time. Dr. Malik, are you okay to go for another 10 minutes, or what is your timing allowing?
Yeah, that's fine.
That's okay. Okay. So I'm going to kind of couch a couple of questions together. I'll ask this one first, and then I'll go to the one that's a little bit more general. What are some of the challenges you have faced in doing data collection and dissemination of the book findings? Um, and I'll ask you the general one after this.
Yeah. I mean, so I did my data collection quite long time ago. It was in 2014 or 15. 14, 15, yeah. During which time it was like very difficult. And of course, I was talking to people who were directly under state surveillance. So it was very difficult to move between groups. And then also because of the politicization of Kashmiri society, to move between camps was also difficult. Like if I have met JKLF people, it was very difficult to talk to Hurriyat sometimes. You know, just to give an example, it doesn't mean exactly like that, but you know, personal rivalries and other things, they get accentuated if you move between camps in certain circumstances. So those were like very strong challenges I faced, but also state surveillance and a lot of investigation on what I was doing, why I was doing, and why I'm writing. I think now I don't even mention it because that has always been part of my career. So it seems like, you know, drinking water for me. So that was certainly there as well, and those challenges I think any Kashmiri would face. But I don't know what's more challenging, to be a Kashmiri or to be a scholar. So they'll have to choose their battles at this point. Um, yeah, and for my research findings, I think one of the biggest struggles that is worth mentioning right now, as right now we see the kind of academic atmosphere right now in India, where academic freedoms are largely being curbed and there's very little you can do in Indian universities. I remember that when I submitted my research proposal, it was way back when I was starting to do the research for the PhD thesis. And I remember that I was sitting in this, you know, presentation, and then a lot of professors were sitting around me. And when I presented my idea, of course, there was a pin drop silence in the room, and everybody was like, "What is she talking about?" You know. And I had this very funny personal experience where a professor, she said she wanted to see me afterwards, and which I went to her cabin and I saw her, and she just hugged me and she said, "Look, I'm Indian, and I can't tolerate you talking against Indian state. It doesn't matter what your research shows. You shouldn't talk about it. Um, you can say that, you know, it's a problem with ABC person, but uh, you shouldn't really talk about what your research findings have shown or could show." So those are challenges that I faced, and what are more serious challenges are actual incarceration. Like people have, I remember I was one of the first people in JNU of my generation who went to JNU. One of the first people. We were 4, 5, or 6 Kashmiris at that point, and after me, a lot of people came in for getting their PhD degrees. And I remember that as soon as I left in 2016, I think a lot of them are incarcerated right now. They're in jails for basically just writing about Kashmir. So it's a big challenge. It's a huge challenge for us to keep our independence, to keep thinking about our real political social condition. But I'm not sure if we you know, we as a collective can afford to not do it, because we anyways don't, we have not much to lose. So yeah, I wish I had a more positive note, you know, to speak to my people here. I know there are quite a few of them, some of them I know personally, but yeah, the only positive thing I could say is that we don't give up.
I really appreciate you shedding light on these challenges. It's so necessary to recognize them and notice them so that we can move forward in a good way. And for folks who are listening and have good intentions in caring for their Kashmiri scholars or friends, these are things that, you know, it's important for them to understand, and then they can think about ways of supporting as well. So really, really appreciate you sharing those, Insha. I'm going to ask two final questions. One of them is a general question, and one of them is a very specific question. So the general question that we received from our one of the audience is, oh, we've got more questions that people have asked, but I'm going to propose the one that I mentioned earlier. This is from Malik Imran. What is narrative of Dr. Sahiba about resistance movement? And the second question that I would like to propose to you is, how should young scholars protect their work from plagiarism and from theft in the contemporary moment, whether it's within academia or outside? It is a question that's coming from me. I feel that it's an elephant in the room that is otherwise under addressed in our conversations, but I think that it's necessary to think about for folks who are, you know, doing new knowledge curation. So I'll pass over the mic to you.
Yeah. Imran, I think the question is very huge. And I would really suggest you read my book, because I have explored the narrative of resistance politics in Kashmir. What is the common theme that appears from the research that I've done on Kashmir, and I've seen and I've talked to people and I've lived through it? The narrative is that Kashmiris want self-determination, which means they would like to be able to determine what their political status is. So, which means that, of course, Kashmiris are, a vast majority of them are Muslim. They are fairly aware of their identity and their politics, and I guess that's part of politics right now. Um, and the notion of self-determination is where Kashmiris can actually have a say in their political future. This is a right that was, somehow decolonization of India and Pakistan allowed for India and Pakistan to have. So I think Kashmiris are seeking the same right. And it's not something new, because if you look at the book and I trace it, the earliest right to self-determination movement in Kashmir began in 1850, where Kashmiris organized into a sort of labor rights protest against the Dogra rule that they saw as a foreign occupation of their land. And they wanted the British installed Dogra rule to be removed, and there be a sort of structure or political system where Kashmiri will or political ideas are taken into account. And the book deals with that massively. And in terms of like nitty-gritties of what it could mean and how it should happen, I don't think the discussion about resistance politics is there. Right now, especially after 1989, Indian state has been brutal in crushing Kashmiris, and primarily for their Kashmiri and Muslim identity. And then, therefore, because of that, Islam or Islamic identity has become an important factor, and they seek to protect Kashmiris seek to protect their religious identity as well, which will be which will be in general part of the larger political narrative. So I think it's not a very simple question to be answered in a few minutes, but yeah, I would definitely recommend you read the book. And I think there are lots of other scholars who have done enormous work on Kashmir's self-determination movements. So I think that should help, Imran. And the other question about plagiarism and theft, yeah, it's a can of worms, because as the intellectuals who fight for knowledge to become more accessible, we understand how neoliberal corporate greed has created academic cultures that are inaccessible to people and scholars from oppressed communities. So while I personally mostly encourage the idea of free and open source knowledge in general, I think it's also important to uh, you know to uh, to fight the kind of exploitation that happens of indigenous scholars in within the Western academy, to create also alternative sources and spaces for them to publish, or for them to create like possibilities for having a world of ideas outside of the neoliberal world. I don't know what else can be done. Binish, like it's a very complex question. But in my own, like for my own self, what I have tried to do is I have as much as I could, I have fought back on any attempts or moves that can confiscate or obfuscate my voice, or give it to someone else. And I have at some point even stopped participating in cultures that are predatory and exploitative. I know that we can't always afford that, which is why I say that it's important for us as Indigenous scholars as well to create spaces where people can, publish their words, publish their content without the fear of getting, not having recognition, or getting basically even getting exploited by their own professors or supervisors, because that is very common in the academy as well. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you're tired. You've been speaking for a very long time. No, there's one more question in the chat. I'm gonna read that out to you, and then what we'll do is, if you can just transition into some concluding thoughts that you have. The question is from Mir Yasser Mukhtar. How can women in Kashmir take part in resistance apart from putting their lives in trouble? There's also a general comment from Shamshad Zwande, which says, nowadays being a Kashmiri itself is a big challenge. With that, please take it
Yes.
away.
I think what we misunderstand about resistance as people of East, is we think that resistance is all about going out and participating in a protest. I don't think that's necessarily true. Resistance is basically to fight off any sort of political process that seeks to strip us of our basic rights. So if I have rights, I shouldn't allow someone to take them away from me. So I think women or men or societies or cultures or communities can come together and create cultures that can, uh, you know, that are resistant to any sort of exploitation or ripping off of our collective rights or individual rights. um, I think for women to be able to be active in resistance, it's important for men to create, support and culture where women feel safe to participate. And it's basically the biggest revolution or resistance that I have understood in my own life is in the way you think. If you can support that, if you can create possibilities for new thinking or fresh thinking to come, that pushes that pushes away the kind of dehumanization that we are subjected to collectively. I think will be successful as men and women, to create more positive and liberationary and freedom-seeking cultures for ourselves and our communities. And for the last comment from Shamshad, who's my student, by the way, I know what you mean, Shamshad, and I think our struggles are collective struggles. They are not struggles for only Kashmiris. They are struggles for the region. We are a region that has been subjected to endless war, imperialism, and it's time for not simply a kind of protest, but a sort of a thinking revolution to occur, where we can change the way world is for us. And I'm hopeful that with my students like yourself, we will be able to achieve that.
Thank you so much, Inshah, for spending time with us today. It has been a pleasure getting to know you better. A link to where you can find Dr. Malik's book is provided in the Facebook or YouTube comment section below. With that said, thank you to all of you who have joined. We would love to hear thoughts on what you thought of this episode. You can share your thoughts in the comments. Please also share the video. It is recorded and will be viewable later on on our accounts. And you can follow Dr. Malik on her Twitter at Inshah_Malik. Let me pop that up. And so, and there's a link to our website as well here with a link to a donations page. Azadi Now is Kashmir Gulposh's independent media platform, and we're currently fundraising to continue being able to bring you this type of programming. So we just have to pay for certain subscriptions that don't cost a lot, but a little bit of help with that would be appreciated. Please help us keep the show going and growing through your financial support, and get in touch with us if there are things that you're thinking about. We would love to hear from you. Thank you again, Inshah, so much.
Thank you so much, Binish. Really appreciate it.